Hey guys, today we're going to talk about how to take apart the rear of the bike. That includes taking off these passenger grab rails, this rear plastic, and the rear fender. And you may want to do this if you're changing out the rear taillight, if you're putting on a fender eliminator kit, or you're swapping the rear turn signals. We'll start by taking off the passenger seat. Next, we're going to take off the front part of the seat by removing these two 6mm bolts. Next, we're going to remove the passenger grab rail by taking out the two 6mm bolts. There's one in the front, and then there's another one in the back. Before we remove the rear bolt, which is here, we need to take out the toolkit. Once the toolkit is out, we can take this bolt out with a 6mm wrench. Make sure you hold the passenger grab rail while you're taking this out, because at this point it's loose and it can fall. Then we'll repeat the process for the other grab rail. Next, we're going to remove these 4 bolts with a 4mm Allen wrench. These have little plastic washers on them, so make sure you don't lose those. To remove this rear plastic, we're going to pull this back and spread it apart. When you get the plastic off, you'll see this rubber damper that sits above the taillight. This might come off, so make sure you don't lose this. Next, we're going to remove these 4 bolts that were underneath the toolkit. At this point, you'll feel the rear fender starting to droop down, but it's still held in place by another set of bolts. Now we're going to remove these two 5mm Allen bolts. They're just behind this flat bar behind the battery. Okay, at this step, we're going to pull this plastic apart, and there's just 2 prongs that are holding it in place. And so as you pull this, as you separate it, these are the prongs. This whole lower plastic piece will drop down. And we're just going to rest it right here. Next, we have to disconnect the license plate light and the turn signals. And these are these connections right here. Here's a little trick. Since this plastic is unsupported, once we take the rear fender off, this thing will fall down. But if you take the rubber tool band holder, which normally comes up and over and then clips into this hook, if you just pull this from the bottom, you can clip it on here, and then it'll hold this piece up, and that'll free up this fender for us to be able to take it out. Okay, now that we've got the turn signals and the license plate light disconnected down in this area, we need to undo these white clips and free the wires that run to those lights. There's going to be one large wire that runs to the rear tail light, not the turn signals, and this one can stay in place because the connector for this is actually in the back of the bike. So here's the connector for the license plate light. Here's a connector for one of the turn signals. And here's a connector for the other turn signal. One little tip that I have, and this is whether you're working on your bike or your car or even something around the house, if you take pictures before you start, it's really handy to have those on your phone so that you can look back and see how the wires were routed. Hopefully you can refer to this video to help you with that, but if you're out working in the garage and you're working on your own bike, it's nice to be able to see how everything was set up so that when you're putting stuff back together, because it might be later that day, it could be days or weeks later that you're working on it again, you don't have to rely on your memory to get everything back the way that it was. Now the two turn signal wires run through this white clip right here, so we'll just pop those out. So we've got these 3 wires free. These go to the 2 turn signals and to the license plate light. At this point we should be able to take out these 2 screws to drop down the rear fender. Alright, so to get the rear fender out, we're going to loosen these 2 screws. Actually, I'm going to undo this rubber band, give myself some room to work. Alright, so in order to get the rear fender off, it's made out of 2 pieces that's split down the middle, and you kind of have to spread it apart and then it'll come off of this main plastic piece. And then these wires, you have to get through these little grooves so that they can drop through these 2 holes right here. I'm going to resupport the rear fender. And in case you didn't catch it, the turn signal leads come through this hole on the left, and the taillight lead comes through this hole on the right. And that gets the fender off. To reinstall the rear fender, we're going to feed the turn signal leads through this hole on the left. And the wire for the license plate light through this hole on the right. Once you get these wires through the channels, we'll use these black screws to reattach the fender. To reattach the rear taillight, make sure you have the metal washers that are on the bottom of the rubber grommets on the taillight. Those go onto these 2 well nuts. And then you'll reattach it with these 8mm bolts. The bolt with the metal hook on it goes on the left side. And make sure this rubber damper is in place on the top of the taillight. Before we finish reinstalling this lower part of the rear fender, I'm going to hook up these wire connections, make sure everything works, and because it's a lot easier to fix any problems now rather than wait till everything's put back together. So I'm hooking up the license plate now, and this is hooking up the tail light. I'll plug my wire adapters into the turn signal connections. Like I mentioned before, I'm not sure whether the gray or the black turn signal connector is for the right or the left. So what I'm going to do is a test right now. I'm going to hook up one of these black to black. That's the negative. And white to red. That's positive. And I'm just going to see which turn signal comes on. Okay, so I'm going to turn on the right turn signal with the turn signal switch. And I got lucky, the right turn signal is turning on. If the wrong one turns on, all you have to do is flip the wires. So I'll hook up the other turn signal. Now both of them should work. It's the right signal, left signal. Now in order to connect the integrated tail light, I need to see whether green or brown is right or left. And this is probably in the documentation for the light. I was just too lazy to look, and it's so easy to figure out. So I'll try hooking up this connector to this signal. Okay, so that's backwards because the right signal is on here and the left is on here. So I'll flip this wire. Alright, now everything should be working right. Left signal. Right signal. Perfect. Alright, now we're just going to reroute all the wires, make sure everything's in the right place. Okay, now we're going to lift this back up and get it reattached. There are two plastic tabs, one on each side right up here, and you just kind of have to pull the plastic apart to fit it over it. Alright, we'll reattach these 4 bolts right here. To get these bolts in, you'll have to apply some upward pressure to the bottom of the fender. Next, we have to put these last 2 5mm bolts into these 2 holes down here. The one on the right mounts the bracket for the turn signal connections. So we'll drop it through that bracket first. And these are just going into rubber well nuts, so they don't need to be very tight. Okay, now we're going to remount this plastic. There are 4 hooks along the side, and then 2 grooves in the, or 2 prongs in the back that sit on this rubber damper. Alright, once all that's in place, we'll put back these 4mm bolts. And don't forget that they have those plastic washers on them. Alright, now we're going to remount the grab rail. This uses 2 6mm bolts. One comes in on the front side. And it's important to note we are threading a steel bolt into aluminum, so make sure that you're tightening carefully at first so that you don't get it cross-threaded. And then tighten the other 6mm bolt from the top. And then lock both of these down. And then repeat it on the other side. Then we'll replace the seats. Start with the front. Hook these 2 tabs underneath the gold bar. And then put in these 6mm bolts on the top. Alright, I'm going to replace my toolkit and my kickstand pad, and then put the seat back on.